Luther's rebellion against the church now brings him into conflict with the most powerful political ruler of his time. And so now we're going to start to look at, it's fine for Luther to come up with his own theological ideas, but how are these ideas going to shape the overall context, the overall political context of Europe and even the Western world at this time? And this political ruler was Charles V. Charles V ruled over an enormous empire. He was the heir to Burgundy, which is this area in orange that you see here, through his father. He was heir to the Habsburgs, so those are the areas over here, modern-day Austria. Through his grandfather and through his grandmother, Isabel of Castile. Remember Isabel from Ferdinand and Isabel, who united Spain. Through his grandmother Isabel, he was a ruler of Spain and also of all Spain's territories in the New World. And through Spain, ruler of Spain's territories in southern Italy, the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily that we've talked about. Constructed alliances with the kingdoms of Portugal and England and the Duchy of Savoy, and he gained territory in northern Italy in the area of Milan and Eastern Europe. And so he has amassed an empire of over 2.5 million square miles, the largest empire in the history of the world at that time. Now, when you're that powerful, you tend to have rivals and enemies, and Charles also had plenty of those. First was the King of France, Francis I. Francis was worried about Charles because Charles' allies and lands, as you can see from this map, surround France. So France is kind of the odd one out here, and Francis I is trying to find allies to protect himself against Charles. Another rival of Charles is actually the Pope. So remember how the popes were always afraid of the medieval emperors and how the medieval emperors were controlling land that surrounded the papal states. They were worried that these emperors would come to control the papacy. Remember that the popes have only just returned to Rome after having been driven out of their city of Rome, by a powerful political ruler. And you can see how, looking at this map, that the popes would feel threatened by Charles. Now, unlike with Francis, the popes don't ever go to war with Charles, but they are going to be a little uneasy about fully cooperating with him. Another group that is uneasy about Charles or resist Charles are local German rulers. You can see them colored in blue here. And that's because the Holy Roman Empire was typically kind of a loose coalition of principalities. The emperor was the most powerful of these rulers, but couldn't dominate the other principalities. And that changes with Charles. With Charles, now you have a situation where you have an emperor who really is powerful enough to dominate the other little principalities that make up the Holy Roman Empire. And so some of these local German territories are trying to resist and undermine Charles's power because they want to limit his influence to the traditional influence of German rulers or German emperors. And lastly, of course, you have the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which is a rival to Charles in the southwest Mediterranean, Spain and Italy, but also in Eastern Europe. So these are areas where the Ottomans are traditionally trying to expand and where Charles stands in the way. Charles was a committed Catholic, committed to defending the Catholic Church and defeating Lutheranism. He's also Luther's political sovereign. That's because Luther is in these territories here in the Holy Roman Empire, and so he is, in theory, under Charles's jurisdiction. And so once Luther has been excommunicated, declared a heretic by the Catholic Church, he comes under Charles's judicial influence. It's now the role in Europe at the time of the political ruler to summon a heretic to appear before him and to sentence him. So a political ruler is supposed to also protect the legitimate practice of Christianity in their lands. Once someone has been condemned as a heretic, it's the duty of that ruler in this time to prevent heretics from teaching false truths or truths that the Catholic Church has decided are false as the legitimate practice of Christianity. And so Charles summons Luther to attend a meeting called the Diet of Worms in 1521. And so Luther appears before Charles, and this is where Luther is facing political consequences. He's already been excommunicated. Now the question is whether he still persists to his heresy. Charles will levy some kind of political punishment on him. And Charles tries to convince Luther to change his teachings. He says, Luther or Martin, either if you are right, that means that every single bishop and pope in the history of the church for the last 1500 years got it wrong. Just on a prudential matter, that's something that I'm not willing to accept. And so this is very much a traditional Catholic response to Protestantism at the time, an appeal to the traditions and the apostolic succession and authority of the church. Whereas Luther's appeal is very much a traditional Protestant appeal. It's an appeal to individual conscience. Luther says that may seem logically to make sense to your eyes, but unless my teachings can be proved false to my own individual satisfaction, I will not compromise. And so Charles convicts Luther of heresy, commands him to be taken away to be imprisoned. On the way, as Luther is traveling to his place of imprisonment, masked horsemen appear out of the shadows. They seize Luther and he disappears. And for a time, no one knew where Luther had gone. In fact, Luther had been abducted by one of the German dukes, who was ruled over by Charles V, named Frederick the Wise. Frederick the Wise at the time was no Protestant. He was very proud of his collection of relics, and Luther hated the practice of relics. He saw this as venerating human beings, practicing human traditions that were not found in the Bible. But Frederick the Wise had another angle here. He was a rival of Charles V. He had wanted to be selected as emperor instead of Charles V. He saw protecting Martin Luther as a way of weakening Charles's influence in Germany. So here's the first time where you can really see the political intersecting with the religious in the history of the Reformation. If Frederick the Wise doesn't have something political to gain from Luther surviving, it's quite possible the Protestant Reformation could have been crushed here. Without Frederick's political power, his ability to rescue Luther and keep him safe in his lands, it's also highly likely that the Protestant Reformation would have been halted in its tracks at this time. During this time in seclusion, in this room depicted up here, in the castle depicted here, the castle of Frederick the Wise, Luther further developed his theology, and now fully estranged from the church, his theology becomes more and more radical. And he begins by rejecting scholasticism. And in some ways, this is very dissimilar to your typical Renaissance thinker. Your typical Renaissance thinker saw the Renaissance as a continuation of scholasticism, the use of reason and human senses to understand the world, and through understanding the world to understand God. But for Luther, this is not certain enough. One has to rely instead just on the Bible. He also publishes a translation and a commentary on the Bible in German. Now, the commentary, of course, is shaped by Luther's Protestant theology. This is an exercise that in some ways is very much consistent with the Renaissance. Exploration of different vernacular languages and the study of vernacular languages and ancient biblical languages together is something that we've seen as very common in the Renaissance. And Luther is responsible for other Renaissance projects as well. He's responsible for writing a large number of hymns. And Luther's work in the German language is very much responsible for the construction of German into the language that we know today. Just in the same way that Shakespeare is kind of seen as the father of modern English, Luther is seen as the father of modern German. Luther's theology is going to become more and more radical as he moves away from using reason to support the teachings of Christianity. He also moves away from the traditional Catholic theology of the sacraments. He maintains baptism as a sacrament of initiation. He retains the liturgies of the Mass, but claims that the Catholic Mass or the Mass is not a sacrifice, but simply a gathering of Christian community. He teaches that the Eucharist is consubstantial. Again, this is where the teachings get a little bit into the weeds, but just bear with me. Whereas Catholics had taught that although the Eucharist looks like bread and wine, after the priest has consecrated it, it becomes the body and blood of Jesus. Luther taught that the body and blood of Jesus was simply added to the Eucharist. So that's the distinction that Luther's making here, that it's also a rejection of traditional Catholic teaching. He rejects the practice of confession to a priest. He rejects the sacraments of holy orders and confirmation. And this is, again, very consistent, very much going to set the tone for Protestantism. A rejection of hierarchies and a rejection of intermediaries. Whereas Catholics had seen the individual human being as part of a broader tapestry, where they had responsibilities to those below them, they owed obedience to those above them, that grace was given through the Church of God, by God to the Church, and through the Church to individual believers. For Luther, there's a rejection of this practice of intermediaries, in a sense that all you need is a human being and a Bible, and that's a direct line to God. And so these are the ways in which Luther's theology is becoming more radical during this period. Now, Luther returns in 1522. He returns from exile, and different German regions across the German Empire start to embrace Luther's practices. It becomes known as Lutheranism. And the Church, the Catholic Church, and Charles try and prevent the spread of this teaching, but they are unable to. And so you find that these rulers are seizing Catholic monasteries, which they see as communities of works rather than communities of faith, and we find that the movement continues to spread. Luther dies in 1546, and Charles is too busy fighting other conflicts that he placed as a higher priority than taking on Luther. He's first of all concerned with fighting against the French in Italy, so Italy is this mishmash, as it always has been, of competing French, Spanish, German claims, and the Spanish trying to defend their territory against the French. It takes until 1544 to fully defeat them. In the midst of this, the Ottoman Empire again tries to expand to the west, and the Ottomans have been defeated by sea at Lepanto. Their naval power had been destroyed. They were still a powerful force on land, and so they attack the Austrian city of Vienna, kind of the gateway to Eastern Europe. And Charles is able to help send some support to help an army of Poles defeat the Ottomans. And this is really the final Ottoman effort to expand into the West. After this defeat, Europe isn't really threatened by an Ottoman invasion anymore. However, all this takes time, energy, and resources away from trying to defeat Luther. And so, or not so much Luther himself, but just the spread and the acceptance of his ideas. So more and more territories in the Holy Roman Empire are embracing this teaching, and in 1555, Charles is forced to come to a treaty between himself as the emperor and the Catholic princes of the empire against the Protestant princes. It's because Charles can defeat each of these princes individually, but he's not able to defeat all of them. And so this treaty, the Treaty of Augsburg, determines a principle of cuius regno, eius religio, of whose reign, of his religion. And so the idea is that the religion of the prince will be the religion of the state. So it's kind of like saying today, if your governor is a Presbyterian, then all your political ceremonies, swearing in of new officials, etc., are going to be conducted as sort of a Presbyterian ceremony. If they're Catholic, it'll be part of a Catholic ceremony, etc. This treaty ensures the survival of Lutheranism because it means that those rulers who promote Lutheranism aren't going to be suppressed, and it ensures the religious division of Europe. And so this ensures that Luther, who had spread his teachings more successfully through the printing press, and it benefited from desires for political independence